It's all good. It's all good.
We're off.
All right.
Are we doing this?
We are.
We're doing
Let's do it. We stood in different positions last time, so I'm going to mix things up for this time.
Okay, we can roam around and swap over.
I don't know. Too much change all at once may be a bad thing. We'll get to that part later. Who are you? Why are you here?
My name's Dan. I run a small software consultancy called Engineer Better. And you can contact me there if you want to ask me questions about the talk today. I got chatting to Emma at a meetup, and I soon realized that we had very, very different contexts in our working environments. We led very, very different teams. And what began as an idea to compare those two things has become something quite different, which is a journey for me, I think, and an improvement process that we're going through. And I'm hoping to convince Emma to adopt some of my practices as well, but we'll get there. We're doing this 5 times. You're seeing the second iteration of it. And it's really great for us to be able to actually improve this and keep going with it. And we'll give you the links to the resources and slides afterwards. Emma, who are you?
I'm Emma Hogbin Westby. I currently work for the United Nations. Quick disclaimer, I do not speak on behalf of the United Nations. And some of the things that I will speak about today are not official policy, but they are how my team works. We are a completely distributed team, so quite different from how Dan approaches things. I can be reached on Twitter at EmmaJaneHW. And let's give them a bit of a taste of what they're in for today.
So we're going to talk not just about who we are and why we're doing this talk, we want to find a bit about you, so we'll ask you some questions in a minute. And then we're going to explore what we even mean by a humane team and how that might change depending on what your point of view is. And we wanted to give you something you can take away and actually some actionable content. So we want to propose a kind of framework for thinking about how you can improve the teams that you're in, regardless of what the context is.
So quick show of hands, I'm very much on the distributed side of things. I've got team members who are as far away as Australia and as close as Sheffield. That's my closest team member. So from the quite exotic to the very exotic. And I have worked almost exclusively on distributed teams for almost my entire 20-year career, with brief stints every now and then with collocated teams. And Dan, on the other hand?
So I've had a mix of experience, but most recently I'm working in predominantly collocated teams. So Engineer Better, we started April last year, and we have, in large part, co-opted not just sort of XP values and practices, well, obviously where we're pair programming, but we have, we work quite closely with Pivotal, who are one of the sponsors today, and they have their own kind of brand of XP, which they call the Pivotal way, and we actually adopt that. So we strongly favor pair programming in person in the teams that we work in, and we always favor building collocated teams. So before that, I've worked in a mix of different environments, but through the process of running this business, I've started to realize that it's not always possible to build those perfect collocated teams where everyone's pair programming all day. So this talk is partly about that and some of the challenges that I've encountered.
So within the group here, how many folks right now are on what they would think of as purely a collocated team? Everyone comes into the office every single day. Show of hands. That's probably about a third, 2/3, half is in the middle of those two. And how many people would see themselves on purely a distributed team? They've never met some of their coworkers. There's about 10 of you, oh, more, 20, okay, good. How many are on blended or have a few remote employees? Okay, that's more than 100% that we're at. And how many folks just don't put up their hands when asked? I know who you are, I know who you are, yeah, that's good, that's good. And how many people put up their hands more than once because they didn't know all the options? Okay, good. There was about 3 that time. So you can see that within this room, there's even sort of a question of, well, what does it mean within this spectrum to be distributed? You know, sometimes we're distributed, sometimes we're collocated. It depends if I'm doing client work, it depends if I'm in the office, all kinds of things. And you'll see throughout this talk, we realized that pretty much all of what we had to discuss could be put onto a spectrum or some form of diagram. So there are there
sliding
are limited
scales. We think
visuals.
We can do everything with sliding scales. So
yeah, limited visuals, but definitely no sort of no option where it's either all the way to the left or all the way to the right. There's always some combination thereof. And how many folks, you may not want to raise your hand if you have other team members in the room, but just sort of have a quick, like blink twice for yes. How many folks wish that they could change something about their team, whether you want to go to a remote-friendly environment or you really wish you weren't stuck at home all the time? So I'm going to look carefully and blink. All right, some of you are willing to, some of you are like, my boss isn't here, it's all good. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so change is inevitable, and certainly we've seen even within the industry some companies that are going toward remote friendly and some that are pulling their staff back into the office. We had, just even beginning of this, the preparation for this talk, some interesting examples that we went back and forth on, and I think for certainly I was going to say limited exposure, but I guess I know a fair amount about the open source community. I would think of GitLab as being a great example of a company that is distributed first and has grown well and has some really interesting practices. So if you are interested in looking more into some sort of formal written notes about how it works, GitLab is definitely a company to look into. Are there any folks from GitLab here today? Not expecting it, but no, okay. Yep.
So I think they have 160 people and they're all in separate locations, which was quite remarkable to me. And there's a great interview that Emma pointed me towards. You can go and look up with the CEO. He talks about some of the things they do to cope with that kind of context. So we talked a lot about location and the geographic aspect of the teams, and we'll be discovering how that impacts what we consider to be humane teams. But while we were prepping for this, we had these weekly Skype sessions, and during one of them I sketched out this crazy death spiral that I'd drawn, and I realized that I'd been in a number of companies before I started the one that I'm in now. I'd been in a number of mostly larger organizations where something was happening that was causing me to want to move on to my next job, but I wasn't really fully conscious of the challenges that I was having. And then later on, once I became more aware of those, and I'd read things like 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and the Project Aristotle research that Google came up with about psychological safety, I started to realize there was this link between this, what I was calling the death spiral, which was when you have a low sense of trust in a team and everyone's feeling like they don't have that psychological safety, it leads to bad things. Bad times are had because if you're in that situation, you cannot have authentic conversations about your work. You start to hide things, you start to pick your battles. People don't feel like they can have healthy conflict, and you need that to be able to surface issues in the team. And in that environment where nobody's communicating effectively, there's a lot of wasted effort because you're doing work that doesn't need to be done because the communication isn't working. People are hiding things or they're duplicating effort. And you end up with this poor sense of progress, people checking out of their teams, or they're less engaged in the work. That leads to more distrust, and it just keeps going round and round and round. But I only really became conscious of that fairly recently, and I think a reaction to that was doing what I'm doing now, which was to say, okay, I need to get past all that. Let's go fully focused on our XP values and practices. And what we're going to do today is link some of those ideas with the idea that you can also address humane working with different styles of local or distributed teams. Now, as I said at the start, some of the aspects of the business I'm in are that we started with this really tight focus on co-location, but it wasn't possible to maintain that because we're a consultancy, so we were working with different customers, different customer engagements. And the most recent one, which is the story I'm about to tell you, was where we were forced to not have a collocated team. So we started to have remote workers. And what I realized, we were really ill prepared for this context. And the challenge was we moved from a collocated context to a dispersed context without actually having any preparation. It became very difficult for me and the team to communicate our presence because we weren't even using any kind of video or anything like that. Because we do pair programming, we didn't have the right things in place to do the remote pairing, so that was a big challenge for us. And we were also trying to support a new hire in that team, and that became really challenging for us. And I think that we created, inadvertently, an inhumane team. Like we were creating, in that environment, something which was not going to be productive and effective.
And this is where the story where I sort of come in, because we were having these weekly meetings, and I had to chuckle a little bit just because they are all experiences that I have lived through myself. So when Dan says we didn't quite have the schedule worked out, we didn't quite have the meetings would start with, I'm so frustrated because stand-up isn't starting on time. It's like, oh, okay, so how are you going to fix that? Well, but they need to just show up on time. Okay, but they're not going to unless you actually put some structures in place and put some guardrails in place that they do show up on time. Well, the equipment doesn't work. Okay, well, what can you do to make the equipment work? And so these sort of things that, sort of like imposing the 5 whys onto the situation. And we started to realize that while we both really like the structure of the teams that we're working on, we both perceive something about the other person's team that we think is completely inhumane. So for me, if you want to jump me to the next one here, please. For me, the idea of having to pair with someone and sat next to them all day is a little bit, not horrifying, but I really like my personal space. And I really like being able to get up, walk away, have a little think about something, come back with fresh eyes, that sort of approach to being in a distributed team. No one can see that I've had a little time out. And the idea of pairing just is, for me, on the scale of far right for inhumane. And yet, in terms of Dan's perception of the collocated, so the distributed teams, to not have crossover with your teammates, or my physically furthest away teammate is in Australia, and I have 7 a.m. meetings once a week so that we make sure that there's a couple of hours of overlap between myself and Australia, and also I will, as needed, do meetings that start at sort of 11 p.m. again, so there's crossover with his morning, just to make sure that he gets kicked off on whatever the priorities are for that particular day. And that just seems completely sane and rational to me, but perhaps not to everyone. So again, we realized that there was effectively this scale of these qualities that could be humane or could be inhumane, depending on your perception of what makes for a fun work environment, what makes for sort of personal satisfaction. I think the one for me that was the most interesting was, and I apologize, you may not be able to read all of those words, but the heroes sort of slots down the middle. And that's one that, how many people have experienced or even watched from the outside a hero culture where there's someone who decides to go it alone, the lone wolf? I'm going to put all kinds of negative terms on this so you can figure out where I
a lot of people
sit on this one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet, when you are the hero, you feel like it is this, this service and this sacrifice that you're giving to your team, that you are genuinely feeling, you feel really good about this work that you're doing. So how is it that it could result in an inhumane team? And for those of you who experienced what it looks like from the outside, you probably know that it results in burnout, it results in tasks maybe not being completed with the thought or oversight or depth that could be completed if an entire team worked on it. So it was these sort of characteristics and sort of thinking about, well, what is it that makes for a humane or a good team? And certainly we come from quite different approaches, and we'll talk a little bit later on about the XP versus Agile Manifesto and how we bring our values into it. But I think it is important to say that I think I run a good team, or I'm part of a good team, and Dan definitely is part of a good team, and yet they are very, very different experiences. So let's...
I was going to point out that pairing was some of the well, not the flip side, but in extension to what Emma was saying. I've also had people who, at meetups or when I've met them said, pairing, like, what, you mean I have no privacy? Like, so all day I'm going to be sitting next to someone and I can't get away from it? That sounds awful. But,
how do you decide when you get to go to the toilet? That's what I want to know.
But if conversely to that, you have, if you've had a great experience of pairing, you know how fun it is and how rewarding it is and effective it is to communicate in small batches and have that person with you correcting every mistake and being able to bounce ideas off someone so cleanly.
You've also done mob programming now as well, have you not?
Yeah, we've done some mobbing, which was like extreme pairing, and I can get a whole talk on mobbing, but yeah, we've done some really successful mobbing, and that introduces some quite interesting practices like
Now there's 5 people you have to coordinate to go to the bathroom with.
5 people, no meetings, no stand-ups, because everyone's got the same context because they did exactly the same thing last week. But 5 people on one computer doing one story. So yeah, it's a nightmare for management because they look at that going, what? Like 5 people to do one job? But you can deliver it quite effectively in that scenario. So yeah, it depends entirely on what you value. I think that's the point, isn't it? So if you value sustainable engineering, having a hero in your team who does all the work and no one else learns anything, that is bad. So yeah, I think it's really, there's so many things we can put on that sliding scale, and it would be great to.
But if you have a team that is completely distributed and there is only the one person in Australia, you really need them to be able to pull out the hero aspect every now and then if the outage happens to happen in their time zone. So there are also positive qualities about having someone who can actually complete the work and do it on their own without additional support or supervision. So the more we talked about the different aspects of it, and there certainly was a lot of brainstorming as we were going through these initial meetings, we realized that there was a need for a framework or for some structure to put into the context of how we could compare what the different points were in the employee life cycle. So we ended up effectively with with kind of this straight line, although there's some wiggles in the middle, looking at the onboarding process, the actual work process, and then the offboarding, or the end of an employee's time at a company. And I think that there are, between the distributed team and the co-located team, there's some clear winners, if that's a fair term to use. For me, I think that the distributed team, which, again, this is my experience, we are really good at checklists, we're really good at documentation, we're really good at writing stuff down because we spend virtually all of our time communicating with our coworkers in some form of text environment. So we happen to use Flowdoc, which is kind of like Slack, kind of like IRC. So there's a lot of capacity there to copy and paste, to move things over. We spend a lot of time, if it's not ticketed, it doesn't happen. So we have this really great written culture. We also, again, as I mentioned, have a lot of checklists, and all of that develops out of the fact that this is a written culture. So I think that we do the joining process quite well because we have a consistent experience, we have consistent documentation, we've got a welcome handbook that we make everyone go through and read, and we've stolen bits and pieces from other companies of GDS. We have a number of elements that we've pulled out of the GDS publicly available welcome package. And we encourage people to edit that documentation and to, so we had, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't laugh first and then say what I'm about to say. However, we did have our first Windows developer join recently. We use Docker, and there wasn't any documentation on how to get everything working. And in our weekly stand-up calls with the multi-team, so there's, I run the ops team plus one team of developers, and then there's an additional 15 teams of developers that we support from an ops perspective. And once a week, Bogdan would give us his update on how it had been going getting Docker set up. And he'd sort of, well, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm getting closer. And so again, it was this process where we could support him and also be able to update the documentation. And because we had this written culture, we were able to get everything, I think, in a place where the next person who comes along and is in a similar situation will have a much smoother experience for it. And because we've got all of the onboarding stuff, I think we also have the offboarding basically for free. When it comes to the end of, either it's a fixed contract and it's simply the end of the budget or the end of the money for that person's term, or they choose to move on, or whatever other reasons, everything that we did to set them up, we now have the opposite that we can go through to offboard them and shut down all of the accounts and make sure that all of that work happens. And there is a transition period to make sure that the documentation is there for the next person. And then in the middle, I think ultimately there's 3 basic stages that you're going to repeat over and over again. So you've got planning, you've got execution, and you've got review. And so the sort of the specifics, whether you're working in 2-week Scrum or whether you're working in effectively a Kanban situation, which is what we do for ops, we don't have sprints, but once a week I close out the board. If you've got, well, any number of different project management methodologies, you're basically within those 3 parts. And within those 3 parts, I think that I really, really miss whiteboards and Post-it notes. I think that co-located teams definitely have the advantage when it comes to planning. And that, yeah, I know. It's okay, you can gloat a little bit.
Got something.
But I think that there is something really unique and special about bringing a team together, and like that wall right there, I just want it filled with Post-it notes. And certainly that will happen in the open space, or I think we're going to do it that way in terms of the open space technologies, where we'll have this sort of shared experience. We're going to be physically next to someone, shoulder to shoulder, figuring out what's interesting. You collect the energy that just doesn't really happen with a distributed team. We do plan, it can be done, but I think there's not a piece of software that can replace that experience. In terms of the execution, well, actually let me skip to review first, because I think review is also somewhere that the co-located experience wins out. When I have done retrospectives with a distributed team, I find that people are more likely to close in, to shy away from engaging. They're more likely to allow someone else to take over the conversation. They're more likely to check their email. They're more likely to just physically check out of the experience. And there's ways that you can overcome that. And certainly the ways that sort of some of the techniques that I've used are to make sure that we've got some questions ahead of time, allow those folks who are less likely to jump into a conversation. You may refer to them as introverts. It doesn't mean they don't have good things to offer. It means they have fantastic things to offer, but they need a bit more prep time. So having those questions ahead of time, asking explicitly, these are the questions that we sort of gave you ahead. Now we want your answers. You can get some really fantastic information out of people if you do have that lag time between the prep and the sort of the experience of the retrospective, but it's hard compared to being in a room where you can read the body language, you can see how people are feeling, you can, again, get the dynamic nature of that experience. And then, so the last one, which I left sort of to the end, is the execution. And I think this sort of, in some ways, is the tiebreaker, because there's not, in my mind, a clear winner. I really like to be able to give people on my team large blocks of solo time to accomplish their work. So as much as we can, we try to have a no interrupt culture. You don't ping someone on text chat unless you actually need them to break concentration. So we want on our team, and again, there's always exceptions to the rule, like when I think something's an emergency and it's really not. But we try and give folks large blocks of time to really sink their teeth into the problem that they have at hand. And that's absolutely not the experience of pairing. So maybe you can give your pitch for pairing on this one.
Yeah, we don't have any rules in our teams about interrupting people. We are prepared for change. We're happy for the customer to interrupt us or from anyone on the team to interrupt us. Obviously, you do it in a socially sensitive way, but if we're all sitting next to each other in the ideal co-located team, then it's fine to just say, oh, do you mind if I just ask you a question about this? And the planning for us, so we would, just to contrast with what Emma was saying, we would structure our week around a Monday planning meeting called an iterative planning meeting, IPM, and we would finish with a retro. But we don't do sprints, so we would just do continuous delivery of stories, and they get done when they get done. But we found that we haven't actually encountered any problems using that either in a co-located context or a distributed context. There's some other challenges that we have had. So if you keep that cycle in mind as a framework for categorizing your problems and the solutions to those, and keep in mind some of the things, the specifics we've highlighted, like trust and safety and respect and kindness and heroes and all of these challenges around pairing and attitudes to those. We're going to run through a few characteristics that we found are either common to us or specific to our context that we thought you could take away and keep in mind as well.
So the first one I think is more Dan's, although I will, perhaps unfairly, remind Dan that he was...
You titled the slide.
I know I did. And so it was just for this moment so that I could say, remember 3 weeks ago when you were really frustrated that someone on your team didn't book the closest hotel to where the physical stand-up was going to happen? And then last night, where did you mention your hotel was relative to where the conference was today? And was it the closest available hotel?
No, I just put the wrong one.
So in terms of planning to work, the work that you have scheduled, make sure that you have the right equipment in place. Make sure that you have actually double-checked the setup, that you are ready to do the work. Yeah.
So some of the challenges that I announced earlier with this new disrupted team that I created this. I hadn't changed the team. I created a new team by saying, oh, you can work at home on Tuesday, or you can go to the preschool day on Thursday. We created a different team, and we were working across time zones with the customer. We weren't prepared for that schedule. We do now, but we didn't have persistent all-day video. Now, regardless of where people are, they know they can go to a Zoom meeting and they will get everybody else who's present and ready for work, regardless of where they're sitting. That has transformed our sense of how we communicate presence to the rest of the team, beyond anything else. We have laptops we have machines set up in the office that actually work when you sit down at them. So you're not trying to plug in some space-age new MacBook Pro into USB sockets and it doesn't work and you've wasted the first 10 minutes of the day. You just sit down and the computer just works. It's like stuff like that we started to do, and we were prepared for people being in the office, out of the office, and it made things so much smoother. The other thing that we've done, which I found really helped, particularly when we think about the fact that I was trying to train up a new hire in this environment, was breaking the stories down in our backlog as small as possible, like being as obsessive as possible about how specific these stories were so that they are achievable. That meant that everyone in the team can get their endorphins, they can get their dopamine hit from delivering work, regardless of where they are, even if they're not familiar with the technologies and the processes in the team that they're in. That was really good for keeping the health of the team up. And I think this is really Emma's.
Yeah, I have harped on this one a bit. So I guess my one sort of quick story on this, I know we're running short on time now, which is always the best way to be in a talk, is the passive-aggressive documentation. So I had a teammate a couple of years ago who didn't like the fact that I wasn't rebasing with Git. I didn't think that it was, quite frankly, worth the effort. But whoever had most recently updated the documentation was whoever's methodology was used for the different workflow processes. And it was through this passive-aggressive editing of documentation that we came to understand how the other person needed to work to be most effective. And if we'd not had this written sort of transaction piece that went back and forth, I think it would have taken us a lot longer to actually understand what it was that the person needed to be successful. So I'll move on to the next one at this point. And then ultimately, the team needs to work from shared values. And it doesn't need to be universal values, but they need to be shared within that team. And I think for those of you who said, I want to change the team that I'm working on right now in some way, is it you who've grown out of, or has your team or someone else in your team grown out of what used to be shared values, or perhaps you just never shared the values of that corporation or the way that company wanted to do the work? So we're coming from an XP and Agile perspective.
So I wanted to refer back to that death spiral I talked about at the start, and one of the things I realized recently was that the XP values that we had were great antidotes to these challenges. So if you have, we've missed simplicity off this list, but if you have respect, courage, communication, and feedback, they all reinforce each other, and they help sort of be the antidote to that lack of safety and trust and lack of communication and effective, authentic communication in the team. So we found that incredibly useful, and the practices that we have are really evidence of those values.
And then on the Agile side, I'm very much sort of the big idea of the Agile Manifesto, not specifically Scrum, not specifically any implementation of the Agile Manifesto. So the things on the left are of more interest to me than the things on the right. So in terms of, I've talked a lot about documentation, and it's not necessarily that it's extensive documentation, it's more that we have a starting point that is written down, and we are willing to adapt that documentation. We're willing to allow people to make those edits, to be part of the process, to comment in the document, to approve the changes, to change the way we work, to accommodate the people that we have on our team, and to make sure that we have those conversations and that we are actually working as effectively as possible as both individual team members and as a collective.
So, in summary, hope that you can identify with some of the things we've talked about today and some of the different contexts we've talked about that means something to you. And the 4 key points then we wanted to take away were, start with some shared values, make the work achievable, break it down into small chunks so people can feel like they're getting rewards from that. Prepare for your next context is something that I'm doing now because I know that the team I described is going to change again. We're scaling it up and we're going to be adding more juniors to it, so it will be a completely different team and I need to prepare for that. And write stuff down, and that's useful regardless of where you're working, isn't it? We've both found that useful. If it works, write it down. Don't be afraid to change it if you need to.
That was our sort of experience in having investigated both distributed and co-located teams, and I think we've both sort of learned from the other. I'm not sure that we've convinced one another to immediately switch the type of work we're doing, but it has been an interesting adventure for us to talk about it, and I'm hoping that it has been of interest to you, and certainly we'll be around this afternoon, so if folks are interested in exploring more, please do put some topics up on the open space boards, and we would love to chat with you about it. Thank you.